Welcome to another episode of Biome Bites. In these episodes, it's just me with no guest talking about specific topics, and they're shorter clips. So, for those that don't like to tune into the really long form, almost hardcore microbiome gut health conversations, hopefully these are of use to you. So, today we're going to be talking about how to improve your microbiome, and more specifically, we're going to be talking about three things. We're going to talk about prebiotics, probiotics, and polyphenols, all of which have come up from time to time, sometimes very frequently, on the Inside Matters podcast so far. So before we get into the detail about the three Ps, let's talk about what the microbiome is and have a refresher. So the microbiome is a term used to describe all the microorganisms that inhabit a particular part of the body, or indeed within the wider environment within the world. The term microbiome also includes their collective genomic potential, so in other words, all of their genes, and their collective theatre of functional activity. You can think of the microorganisms as an orchestra, and the music is what they produce. And some people think that actually it's the music that they produce, their products of metabolism, that are more important than their presence themselves. So there's microbiomes everywhere. You could go as far as saying the world is actually one big microbiome. And you could even go a step further depending on how kind of wacky and forward-looking you're being and say that actually the universe is just one big microbiome. But anyways, bringing us back to the subject matter for today's conversation, we're going to talk about how you can improve your microbiome in the context of the human body. So the microbiome we're going to speak about today is the gut microbiome. There, as I said earlier, are microorganisms all over the body, inside and outside. In fact, there are probably more microorganisms living on and inside of you than there are human cells that make up your own body. And that kind of ratio varies depending on when you've been to the loo. So before you've been to the loo for number 2, you're more microbial than human. After you've been to the loo for number 2, you revert back to being more human than microbial. So that's a little fun fact for you all. So there's a very high concentration of microorganisms in your intestinal tract. The composition changes as you go through from mouth down to your anus. And the highest concentration within the intestinal tract is your colon, your large bowel. So in health, there's what we call a healthy balance of microbial communities that all contribute to key functions within the body. However, imbalances can occur. And there's a variety of different reasons for why you can get an imbalance, how you can get an imbalance. And typically they're all factors that relate to the environment that we live in. So consumption of antibiotics, not being outside in the dirt and in the open environment. We have a kind of hyper clean environment now. We wash our hands all the time. Everything's cleaned, everything's sterilized. Our food is more sterile than it used to be. And indeed the variety of our diet has changed dramatically over the course of the last 50 to 100 years, and our fiber consumption in particular has decreased massively. So first things first, if you want to improve your microbiome and shift it from being unhealthy to healthy, you need to focus on your diet first and foremost. A lot of people jump straight into, what supplement should I take? What probiotic capsules should I take? What's the one thing that's going to change my microbiome? And I always push back and say, there isn't any one thing. And the reason why there's no one thing is because it's an incredibly complex ecosystem. If you think about it like a garden or a forest or a coral reef, to give you some other real world examples, the complexity means that there's no one thing that's going to benefit everything within the ecosystem. So you need to think about your microbiome as a garden or a rainforest or a coral reef. So there's a variety of different things that we need to do. And the good news is that we're kind of responsible. We have power to improve our microbiome. Now, going back to the start, I said we're going to talk about prebiotics, probiotics, and polyphenols, the three Ps. And these are three key elements to having a healthy microbiome. Now, I didn't coin the three Ps term. It came from someone called Mark Hyman, who has a really awesome podcast called The Doctor's Pharmacy. And that's pharmacy, F-A-R-M, which I really like, because his view is that actually you can generate more beneficial outcomes on your health through going to the farm or going to the grocery store than going to the actual classical pharmacy and getting a medicine that's been produced and is off the shelf. So I think that's really cool. So let's talk about probiotics first. So probiotic is a term that's used to describe a single microorganism that, when administered in sufficient quantities, confers a health benefit to the recipient. And there's an actual definition that you can look up on the World Health Organization website, and it's basically word for word what I just said. Now, let's take a step back. We'll all be familiar with probiotics as things we buy in capsules or things we buy in tubes or sachets that we mix with food or that we just consume in the form of a capsule. One point I just want to make is that almost all of the quote-unquote probiotics that you can buy off the internet or off the shelf in the supermarkets or whatever store it is you go to don't actually meet the definition of a probiotic because they haven't been tested robustly in clinical settings to prove that they actually have a health benefit. So that's just one thing to think about. Now, probiotics can be isolated microorganisms, or they can be found in what's called probiotic foods. And my recommendation actually is not to take probiotic supplements. It's to spend that money on probiotic containing foods. And your classics are your fermented foods and your fermented drinks. So things like kombucha, things like kefir, although caution with kefir. Kefir contains dairy because it's a fermented milk, and some people's intestinal tract gut can't actually tolerate milk. They get sensitivities. So you need to make a decision yourself as to whether or not that's going to be useful. Other things that contain probiotics are kimchi, kefir. There's something we could do there with the K's, I think, and miso. And I think that's where I'm kind of exhausting to the top of my head. Probiotic containing foods. Also cultured yogurts, not quite kefir. Essentially anything that's been fermented or has part of a fermentation process is likely to contain microorganisms. Things like cheese as well, but in the context of cheese, you also get back to the dairy conundrum, and not everyone can tolerate dairy. So I would recommend that instead of spending your money on these supplements, you buy as many high quality fermented foods as you possibly can and intertwine those into your diet. Now we're going to talk about prebiotics. So prebiotics are essentially complicated carbohydrates that we can't digest ourselves. So if you think about what you put into your body, there's things that we can break down and we can digest with the enzymes and the anatomy and the physiology that we have within our intestinal tract, and there's things that we can't digest. And you'll be familiar, probably, if you've ever actually examined what comes out your back passage, that sometimes there's things that you've eaten that haven't been broken down at all. And there's a variety of different reasons for that, but one of which is we either don't possess the capability to break them down, or microorganisms haven't broken them down fully. So our microorganisms feed on the things that we can't break down in the context of these complicated carbohydrates. And essentially there's two types of fiber which could be probiotic. One is soluble fiber, which essentially dissolves in water, and the other is insoluble fiber. And there's a variety of different food groups that can be classified into both. I'm just going to pull up my notes here so I can give you an exhaustive list. But essentially, soluble fiber can be found in things like oats, beans, apples, citrus fruits, carrots, and barley. And insoluble fiber essentially increases the bulk of your stool, and this is essentially the roughage, the rough green leaves and vegetables, nuts, cauliflower, things like that as well. So in terms of prebiotics and fiber, I think it's fair to say that not all fibers are prebiotic. Some of them just help form mass in your stool. Other forms of food absolutely are prebiotic. Now, instead of getting into the kind of nitty-gritty of which food is the best prebiotic, which isn't, my recommendation actually is to take a step back and try and eat as many fruits and vegetables as you possibly can. On a previous podcast, we've spoken about having like a mega microbiome shake where you put a load of fiber-containing foods into a shake and having that to drink. I think that's a good idea. But as my thinking's evolved on the subject, I think it's important to start slow and build up gradually rather than trying to go from what you may be having in terms of fiber intake per day, which in this country is like between 10 and 20 grams, and increasing it up to 30, 40, 50 grams. Instead of doing it all in one day, probably going to get a lot of bloating and some gas. You can build slowly. And one way to do that is just to increase and add foods into your diet on a week-to-week basis. And trying to build up that way, and that way you probably won't get the side effects associated with a significant increase in fibre, and over time you can increase your fibre intake to benefit your microbiome. One other important point to note in the context of fibre is you really need to make sure you're drinking enough water, because fibre can pull water from other parts of your body into your colon to form the bulk of your stool. So you really need to make sure that you're having a healthy amount of water every day. It varies depending on how large you are, but a good target would be something like 2 litres over the course of the day. And having a good water intake, hitting that target, also means that the lining of your intestinal tract is likely to be hydrated and healthy as well. So that's just another important point in the context of gut health. So now let's talk about polyphenols, the third element on the 3 Ps. So polyphenols are naturally occurring compounds, which are found in plants essentially, and they're produced as metabolites from plants, and particularly when plants are stressed. So basically the things that polyphenols are contained within are fruits and vegetables. No surprise there. Basically anything that's colourful is likely to contain some sort of polyphenol. I think there's over 500 polyphenols that have been characterised, and polyphenols are both good for us and our cells because they're antioxidants and have other beneficial properties. But importantly, in the context of this podcast, they're also really good for your microbiome, and that's why they form part of the 3 Ps. They stimulate the growth of beneficial bacteria, and they can have almost prebiotic-like qualities. Other things are tea, coffee, and if you listen to the episode from Debbie Shawcross, you'll hear about her views on coffee protecting the liver. Coffee has other health benefits as well, potentially protecting against neurodegenerative disease. And if you get good coffee, obviously it tastes really good too. You'll be happy to hear that red wine contains polyphenols, in particular a polyphenol called resveratrol, which has in a variety of animal studies and human studies been associated with increased lifespan and health span. The pioneer in the kind of resveratrol space in the context of longevity is someone called David Sinclair, who also has a podcast as well called Lifespan, I think. Hopefully I've not got it wrong, but we'll put that in the post show notes and make sure that we've got the link there to David Sinclair's work as well. And in addition to red wine and coffee, dark chocolate also contains a lot of polyphenols. And there are some doctors in America now, it's kind of cool, who are asking their patients to consume more dark chocolate and red wine. Now, we can have a conversation about alcohol and whether or not alcohol is good for the gut. My own personal view is no, it's not good for the gut, but in moderation, I think a little bit of red wine is possibly good for your gut. And there's been some studies published from some French research groups who have shown that red wine drinkers have higher diversity than non-red wine drinkers. There's clearly potentially many co-founding factors there, but just some interesting research for you to know about in the context of red wine. So what we've spoken about today, just to recap, is probiotics, prebiotics, polyphenols. If I was to be even bigger picture, I would talk about improving your microbiome through reducing foods that can be harmful to your microbiome, subject of another episode, replacing or reinstating microorganisms that were there and were lost, or adding in microorganisms that could be beneficial to your ecosystem, and then nourishing. So feeding the microorganisms that you've reinstated or replaced with things that they like to eat. So that's the prebiotic component. The advice regarding fiber is to start small and build up. So if you're having a mega microbiome shake, don't make it absolutely massive. Just add in some more prebiotic fiber containing foods like blueberries, for example, into your shakes. That's it for today, folks. Hopefully you found this useful. This is an Inside Matters Biome Bites episode. If you've got any questions, feel free to email me or reach out on the socials. I hope you've enjoyed it. Thank you.